What do we do when a child is actually delivered instead of destroyed in the womb? That is a viable child. Now, some of my Democratic colleagues have said this never happens. Well, I'd love to introduce you to a friend of mine named Melissa Oden. Melissa Oden, when her mom was 19 years old, was compelled by her family to have an abortion. She had an abortion, her mom did, delivered that child. The child was delivered, and then literally the baby was set aside into the medical waste of that procedure at the hospital. The nurse, then a few minutes later, as she's cleaning up after the procedure, noticed the medical waste was crying and was breathing. It's about what happens if a child survives a botched abortion. That if there's a botched medical procedure, someone dies. This is literally the opposite. That there was a botched medical procedure and someone lives. I would ask any American, if there is a child laying on the table in an operating room crying, what do we do then? I don't know many Americans who would say, kill it. Mr. President, for the past 45 minutes or so, my colleagues have come to this floor to be able to talk about a bill that is coming soon that we'll actually vote on at the bottom of the hour, this hour. It's a bill that we talked about for several years and it's been debated some. It's about what happens if a child survives a botched abortion. Now, I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I've got some other colleagues that are going to step in a moment. That I want to talk a little bit more about this because this seems to be an incredibly misunderstood issue. It's interesting, we most often talk about a botched medical procedure, that if there's a botched medical procedure, someone dies. This is literally the opposite, that there was a botched medical procedure and someone lives. The whole debate is that botched medical procedure that was supposed to take the life of a child ends up actually delivering that child, and now you have a living, breathing child crying on the table, fully viable. The question is, what do we do now? Well, yesterday, my Democratic colleague spent an hour on the floor saying that child should die. I disagree. In all of our conversation about abortion, and we have various opinions in this room and quite frankly across the country, we have various opinions about when is a child a child. Some people believe a child is a child when they have unique DNA that's different than the mom, different than the dad, conceptions occurred, cell division has happened. That's quite frankly how science defines life, is unique replicating cell division. Some people believe that's a child. Some people say, well, it's not a child until there's a heartbeat. Some people would say, well, it's not a child until there's actually a developed nervous system. Some people would say it's not a child until the Roe standard that I hear very often. That's a viable child that could survive outside the womb, which is about 21 weeks of gestation. And I have a lot of my colleagues who will say, well, I want to go back to the Roe standard. But I've yet to have a colleague come to me and say, I'm okay with abortion after delivery. That's what we're talking about in this. What do we do when a child is actually delivered instead of destroyed in the womb? That is a viable child. Now, some of my Democratic colleagues have said this never happens. Well, I'd love to introduce you to a friend of mine named Melissa Oden. Melissa Oden, when her mom was 19 years old, was compelled by her family to have an abortion. She had an abortion, her mom did, delivered that child. The child was delivered, and then literally the baby was set aside into the medical waste of that procedure at the hospital. The nurse, then a few minutes later, as she's cleaning up after the procedure, noticed the medical waste was crying and was breathing. And so the nurse literally scooped up this child and took the child from that room to the emergency room where she survived. Now, folks early on said she would be blind or she would have major heart conditions, she would have everything else. I wish you could meet Melissa. She's amazing. She's fully healthy. In fact, it was years later that she learned her adopted mom had adopted her because her birth mom literally didn't know she still existed. Her birth mom was never told that actually that abortion, quote unquote, didn't work. That child survived. They've since reconnected, Melissa and her birth mom. And her birth mom, with deep regret, thinking about this beautiful child in front of her, that life was almost destroyed. In fact, was planned to be destroyed. Listen, this is not just an academic issue. This is real. Again, it's rare, but the question is, what do we do in those rare situations? How do we track this? How do we engage on it? I would ask any American, if there is a child laying on the table in an operating room crying, what do we do then? I don't know many Americans who would say, kill it. But here's what happens. In a botched abortion in America right now, when a child is actually delivered rather than destroyed in the womb, when literally there was a medical mistake that didn't take the life of the child, but instead delivered that child into life, when that occurs, the current practice is everyone kind of backs away and allows the child to die on the table by exposure. Because it is against American law in every single state to take the life of a child. But if everybody just steps back and watches the child die, that's okay. My Democratic colleagues came to the floor yesterday and said, this is already illegal. Why are we even discussing this? This is already illegal. You can't have infanticide in America. And I would say that's correct. It is already illegal to do infanticide. But what is still allowed is a tiny little loophole that if an abortion was botched, everyone can just back away and watch the child die. They do not have to give that child medical care. That's quite a loophole. And it's painful for me to even have to have this conversation in a nation like ours. Of all the things that we could talk about right now, why do we even have to discuss what to do with a child on a table in an operating room crying? Why is this even a conversation? So, we're bringing a bill to the floor today to be able to fix this. This is a bill we've talked about multiple times in this body, but it should be the absolute easiest common ground piece to face. Which of us, standing in that operating room, would look at a crying child and would say, ignore it? If we wouldn't say it there, we shouldn't say that here.